which is, in the absence of intersubjective relationality, high fantastical, or even, or more precisely, given in the fugal contrapuntal intrication that we can now call, by way of Professors Mackey and Wilderson, fantasy in the hold. And this is a passage from Incognegro. Now all that remains are unspoken scraps scattered on the floor like Lisa's grievance. I am nothing, Naima, and you are nothing. The unspeakable answer to your question within your question. This is why I would not answer your question that night. Would I ever be with a black woman again? It was earnest, not accusatory, I know. And nothing terrifies me more than such a question asked in earnest. It is a question that goes to the heart of desire, to the heart of our black capacity to desire. But if we take out the nouns that you used, nouns of habit that get us through the day, your question to me would sound like this: would nothing ever be with nothing again? This passage is given in the hold that Cherry and Blackwell deconstructively reconstruct, just so you'll know that the music and its performance was never about transcendence unless transcendence is understood as immanence's fugitive impurity. How would you recognize the antiphonal accompaniment to gratuitous violence? The sound that can be heard as if in response to that violence. The sound that must be heard as that to which such violence responds. Wilderson asked the question again so that the question can be unasked, so that we can hear Cherry and Blackwell unask it in and as intimacy and dislocation. The answer to Professor Wilderson's question, the unasking, is mu. Not simply because certain terms and assumptions are incorrect, not simply because the implied opposition of nothing and something, where nothingness is understood simply to veil as if some epidermal livery, some higher being, and is therefore relative as opposed to absolute, doesn't signify. But because nothing, this para-ontological interplay of blackness and nothingness, this aesthetic sociality remains unexplored, because we don't know what we mean by it even when we recite or record its multiphonic swerve. Because it is neither a category for ontology nor for sociogenic or socio-phenomenological analysis, the question can't be answered. What would it be for this to be understood in its own terms, from its own standpoint, on its own ground? This is not simply a question of perspective, since what we speak of is this radical being beside itself of blackness, its appositionality. The standpoint, the home territory, chez lui, the insightful mistranslation of Markman is again illuminative. Among his own, signifying a relationality that displaces the already displaced impossibility of home. And I'm thinking of that famous passage in chapter 5 of Black Skins, White Masks, where Fanon writes, depending on what translation you want to take, but that among his own, the black man has no occasion to be another for another. Can this living together in homelessness, this interplay of the refusal of what has been refused and consent, this common or undercommon appositionality be a place from which to know, a place out of which emerges neither self-consciousness nor knowledge of the other, but an improvisation that proceeds from somewhere on the other side of an unasked question? And I shouldn't have said a place from which to know, I should have said a place from which to study. But not simply to be among his own, rather also to live among his own in dispossession, to live among the ones who cannot own, the ones who have nothing and who, in having nothing, have everything. To live, in other words, within the general commonness and openness of a life in Deleuze's sense, hence the necessity of a philosophy of life, hence the necessity, but also the rigor of a disbelief in social death, where social death is precisely understood as the imposition of the subject's necessity. At stake is the curve, and this is my understanding of social. You understand? Social death is not, it's the imposition of the belief that the only way you can be is to be a subject, right? It's not the interdiction of one's capacity to be a subject, it's the fucking imposition, right, of the desire for subjectivity, right? At stake is the curve and bend, the suppleness and subtlety, not only of contemplation on social life, but of contemplative social life, the force of an extra phenomenological poetics of social life. But this gets us to the horizon of Du Bois, and it is Nahum Chandler who is our guide here, which is why I'm totally happy to acknowledge my own work as prefatory to his. This is the sound of an unasked question. Chant and moan and sprechgesang and babble and gobbledygook, la petit nègre, the little nigger, pigeon, bird talk, birds talk, bard talk, bar talk, our locomotive bar walk and black chant, black notes and black cant, the tenor's eruptive habitation of the vehicle, the monastic preparation of the minds of the little Negro steelworkers. Like a more than three-dimensional transcript of an imaginal manuscript, we touch upon the walls in one another. Let's try to come at it again next time by way of Peter Linebaugh and Fanon. So I'll stop there for today. Anyway. If I had another year to prepare it, it would have made sense. Maybe, I don't know. But I mean, I'm very cognizant of missed connections and unmade arguments and so on and so forth. So I'm happy to try to answer for that, and also just to have a discussion, and also maybe just to, I feel like I want to talk. I just want to make sure that y'all understand how much this work means to me, what it has opened up for me in thinking, and see the hard part, and it's pushed me into a direction where it's pushed me way over the edge of what I can do, you see. So it's kind of embarrassing, actually, but it's also really, thrilling and invigorating too.
Thank you for that, Fred. We're going to talk more about it at breakfast because it was really important as well, as your work has always been. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of the content, the ideas, and where they converge and diverge, I really want to say what I appreciate so much about your work is the way in which you show us how to, and this is my question, right? The way in which you show us how to treat the aesthetic gesture, on its own terms. And I think the word, poetry was used in Ian's introduction, and what I know, what most people should know, is how great a poet you are, in addition to being a great critical theorist. When you were beginning to speak, one of the things that you did, which very rarely does, is you listed the number of jazz musicians and poets as theorists in their own right. And so mine is a selfish kind of research pedagogic question. I mean, if you're sitting down with a grad student and helping them start the work, how do you talk to a person about making a work of art a site of theoretical enunciation on its own? I mean, how do you do that? And how do you help others do that?
Well, we can talk about this. I mean, I'm going to try to answer the question, but I'm just as eager to hear how you do it.
I feel that I've actually been able to do that. I mean, I feel that when I'm going to write poetry, I have to turn off my critical voice, and I have to make an effort to treat poetry and fiction on its own terms. So that's what I'm asking. I'm not sure that I have that.
Well, I mean, for me, the critics, the literary critics who I've most admired are poets, and who kind of constitute a group that, has often been defined as a group of, poet critics, okay? So, I mean, and in the first instance, that's Baraka. as part of my sort of earliest formation, and always being aware that the criticism that Baraka was writing about music and also about literature never sounded like the stuff that I was also being kind of asked to read in grad school, or the stuff in the PMLA. And just be, for me, just making, it was just, I just wanted to sound like Baraka. I just didn't want to sound like that. But I began to be convinced that it wasn't simply about a preference with regard to how, that the preference with regard to how one might sound has sort of has implications for what it is that one can know. It's not enough to, I don't know how people can write, I shouldn't say it that way, but I've tried to pay attention to the kinds of stuff. I write about certain things that I feel impose upon me an imperative to sound like something rather than to sound like